My name is Rem Korteweg. I am a senior research fellow at the Center for European Reform in London. Coming from London, I think I have a different perspective to offer than if you speak to people here in Brussels. Um, the Eurozone crisis created a momentum for further integration on the economic and financial front. And what we see is that the 18 Eurozone countries have taken a lot of steps to build new institutions and new frameworks that basically transfer sovereignty from the national to the European level. However, that leaves the non-Euro countries by the side. And so from their perspective, from the UK's perspective principally, integration might actually mean fragmentation, because the UK increasingly sees itself as being left by the side if indeed its own national interests inside the European Union are not better protected. I think very specifically talking about the UK, one of the things that especially this current government is very critical of is this concept that the EU in itself is a project that should continuously move forward on a path to ever greater union, or ever closer union, or ever stronger integration. And I think when we talk about the future of the European Union, we need to find a model that both collects the perspectives of those countries that want to foster greater cooperation in particular fields, but also those of countries that are much more happy with the way things are, where integration hasn't moved so strongly forward. And I'm still surprised by the debate in the UK about the EU. It's very difficult to find people that are able and willing to discuss the EU in a moderate or balanced fashion. It's either you're for them, or you're either pro-EU or you're anti-EU. There's nothing in between. What we see now in the run-up to the general elections in 2015, as well as the European Parliament elections in May, is very strong concerns about what EU integration has meant in terms of immigration flows into the UK, in terms of rising costs, the antagonistic approach to greater regulation coming out of Brussels. There's also a lot of concern about the changing weight in the European Union, meaning to say that Southern European countries that have a stronger that prefer a stronger role of the state in economic affairs are gaining much more importance. And so the UK, which has a very liberal, open economy and basically says that the state should stand by the side while business and the market do its job, feels increasingly uncomfortable with the fact that countries like France and Spain are continuously dominating a drive for either protectionist measures or greater state subsidies. The UK won't accept a European Union like that. It will want to have safeguards that its voice is still also heard, even when the 18 Euro members start to integrate more and more. And I think this reaches into foreign policy as well. Let's take a scenario where we have a referendum in 2017 and the United Kingdom decides to leave the European Union. If Europe does continue to focus primarily on its own internal problems, without remaining engaged with the rest of the world and thinking strategically about how to defend its interest and to promote its values, then we are in that way going to be left by the side. But I am optimistic that things are happening. And perhaps I can mention just a couple. One is directly in response to the Ukraine crisis. We see that the European Union is starting to think much more creatively and much more urgently about the need to have a coherent energy security strategy. That has a very clear foreign policy dimension as well. It means engaging much more with countries in North Africa as well as in the Middle East. It also means thinking much more differently about the relationship with the United States. The United States has always played a central role in Europe's internal and external relations, and now the energy relationship is also becoming a part of that. One of the most, I think, interesting initiatives that's been taken place, that's been initiated over the past 2 years the past year, is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP. Countries like China, like Russia, like India have a much stronger role for a state-guided capitalist system. So the state plays a much stronger role in the way business is done. That's something that is somewhat antagonistic to the way in which liberal market democracies such as Europe and the US operate. If the US and the EU are able to take this flight forward and to develop a transatlantic partnership which sets global standards, then we're basically forcing the emerging markets to also adopt our standards, which is good for business, which is good for the trade norms that we hold dear, and it's also good for our soft power influence around the world. We need to be very clear that Europe is a resource-poor continent, and so we are inherently looking abroad to gain access to sufficient materials and energy resources to meet the demands of our economy and our citizens. The next 10 to 15 years will see a lot of challenges when it comes to the supply of adequate energy as well as critical resources. Basically, on the energy front, we know that in the next 10 to 15 years we will see a decline in the domestic production of the fields that have produced most of our gas, namely the North Sea. That means that we will become more dependent on either outside sources, or we have to start developing much more in the resources that we might have at our disposal inside some European countries, mainly in the form of shale gas. In the next 10 to 15 years, we will see opening up of new energy corridors. So Europe will start to get more access to gas from places like Azerbaijan, Kurdish Iraq. Perhaps if we have a nuclear deal with Iran, Iran might be able to send some of its gas to European markets. Relations with Algeria will become much more important because Algeria also offers a way to boost European energy supply. Then there is LNG, which would not be connected to pipelines and therefore makes a lot of sense, and also to create a global gas price. LNG mostly comes from Qatar, but we now have the possibility of potentially importing U.S. Shale gas through LNG tankers. Then there is the issue of domestic shale gas production, most likely in places like the UK, Poland. On Europe's border, Ukraine has significant shale gas potential. There is some domestic production in the Eastern Mediterranean, which is interesting, around the waters of Cyprus. And that's if we continue to burn hydrocarbons. But let's hope that we actually are also able to reduce our dependence on hydrocarbons, and then you talk about renewables. Renewables, I think, are important, but they will only be, especially in the next 10 to 15 years, only be a marginal change in the mix, because we will remain so dependent on burning fossil fuels.
And these kind of strategies, are they based on a national level or are they produced on a European level? What's your take on that?
They should be based more on the European level. They are mostly based on a national level. I mean, it is the energy policy is still very much based at still very much a national competence. The EU has a role to coordinate this and to engage in discussions with the different nation states, and to say where do broader interests perhaps benefit a different solution. Also, I think that the EU has a role to play because EU funds are able to be expended to realize certain alternatives. So the European Union is able to subsidize particular renewables. The European Union is able to finance particular, or help finance particular pipeline routes, as it's been doing with some of the projects of common interest that the European Commission has come out with. The European Union is very instrumental in ensuring a deepening of the European energy market through building pipeline interconnectors between different member states. So the European Union is definitely very active and very important, but it is mostly the nation states themselves that determine whether they want to sign a deal with Russia for a new pipeline or whether they prefer to develop a non-Russian alternative, for instance. Over the past 10 years, 20 years, relations with Asia have primarily been around trade. And the EU has negotiated with these countries. They have negotiated so-called strategic partnerships. They're not really strategic in the sense that they cover many issues. They're mostly about simply negotiating a free trade deal or deepening trade relations. I think we have to start moving beyond that. I think we need to start developing a deeper relationship with these countries that touches upon real foreign policy issues and security policy. Asia is not only the continent where we will see the most economic growth over the next couple of decades, and therefore will remain an extremely important trade partner of the European Union, but also the place where we have the most likelihood for serious security issues that can spill over into interstate war. And that would have trade consequences as well. I mean, imagine a scenario where you have a hot conflict between Japan and China, or between China and its neighbors along the South China Sea. If we realize that 50% of all merchant shipping passes through the South China Sea and a significant percentage of hydrocarbons that's shipped around the world passes through this region, any trade disruption will affect European economies immediately. So I think the time is well past to make the argument that Europe has no role to play or does not have an interest at stake in the development of Asian security. I think it does. And I think it's something that definitely needs to be developed.
From our European point of view, that's pretty clear. But what's in the Asians' interest to listen to Europe apart from trade?
That's a very good question. And what we've seen over the past years is that Europeans haven't been taken seriously. Or some European countries have been taken seriously, but not the European Union. Again, because the primary perspective of Asian partners has been that the EU is a trade bloc and nothing more. At the same time, I think that's starting to change. I think we see that this month we've already had the first Chinese president visiting the European Union headquarters here in Brussels, and discussions were much broader than simply about trade. What's in it for the Asians, you ask? On the one hand, it is diplomatic support. I think one thing we need to realize is that tensions between Asian states are growing. There is a lot of discomfort and uncertainty about the way in which China's rise is influencing the regional dynamic and the role that the United States play. We see that in the arms race that's taking place around the South China Sea. We see it in the conflictual relationships between Japan and China. There is basically a diplomatic competition taking place for the favor of Europeans by, in this case, the Japanese and the Chinese. And the reason for that is that Europe still matters on the international arena. There are still two European Union member states who have a veto on the Security Council. European markets are still very important also to Asian suppliers. And so the role that Europe is playing and the side that Europe, whether it's the 28 individual member states or the EU as a bloc, take, is going to be important to the individual national security appreciations of the Asian countries. And so I think that less and less Europe is going to be able to get away with the neutral stance on some of the tensions that is emerging in Asia as it has over the past years. I think we will see a new commission that will be a compromise of candidates, where there's a good balance between Eastern and Western Europeans, between North and South, between men and women. I'm not entirely convinced that that's going to lead to the strong and effective commission that we would like. I also fear, or I also think, I have to say, I also think that we will have a commission that will be somewhat concerned about its relationship with an empowered European Parliament where there's a sizable group of Eurosceptics. Now here's what I hope. I hope that there is a realization among the heads of state at the EU Council level that what Europe needs right now is leadership at the Commission level, which is able to be much more efficient and less, perhaps also less ambitious in its activities. In other words, that it strikes a balance between results and priorities, and that the new Commission takes, say, perhaps 4 or 5 big topics and says these are the topics that we want to focus on in the next 5 years. I hope that energy is one of them, that foreign policy is another one, and that the relationship between the EU ins and the Euro ins and the Euro outs is also another one of them. I hope that it means that we will see a clustering of commissioners, that rather than the 28 commissioners that every member state wants to provide, that we will see groups of commissioners coalescing around these 5 topics. For instance, does it make sense to have both to disconnect foreign policy from development aid and from energy or trade? I'm not entirely sure, as foreign policy covers all these issues, why we need all these different commissioners to take that together. So I would much rather favor a smaller, a leaner and meaner, and in that way also more effective commission. Regarding the role of Eurosceptic parties, I'm perhaps a little bit more optimistic than some other people, that I think that it is highly unlikely that the Eurosceptic parties would reach an absolute majority in the European Parliament elections, and that it would actually force the different groups that are inherently pro-European to work together much more than they have over recent years. And so yes, the majority will be smaller, but it will perhaps be able to bypass some of the somewhat petty political discussions that it has basically harmed cooperation in Parliament up until now, and that they're able to move beyond that. It's anybody's guess at the moment what a referendum in 2017 will look like. It will very much depend on who is in power at the time. If indeed it is the current government, in other words, that you have a Tory party which has the majority, it depends on what, assuming that this is Cameron, what kind of renegotiation, this is this term that he always uses, what he has been able to achieve in favor of his European agenda. In other words, is he able to sell to his constituency that it is good to remain in the European Union? If he is able to show some results of a renegotiation, then I'm fairly certain that the UK will decide to stay in. If, however, Cameron is not able to convincingly make his case, then we might see the reverse. At the same time, there is a lot of uncertainty about the future of the United Kingdom if it is no longer part of the European Union, about its standing in the world, about its trade relations with Europe, about its trade relations with other powers around the world. To give you one example, the UK is one of the largest major proponents of free trade agreements. Will the UK be able to negotiate the same type of free trade agreements with countries like the United States or India or Japan if it is no longer part of an economic bloc of 450 million consumers? I doubt it. And so there is a lot of uncertainty what a UK by itself would mean. And that uncertainty, I think, will inevitably lead to a response that people will opt to stay in the European Union.
Let's see. Thank you very much.